Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This is artifact number 3 in module number 1, and today we're going to explore a couple of the periods within the culture of the ancient Near East. And some of the stuff you'll hear today might tickle the back of your fifth grade social studies brains, because if your fifth grade social studies was kind of like mine, you might have heard some of these things. For example, you might slightly remember the name Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word for the middle of the rivers. And the rivers that we're going to be talking about are the Euphrates and the Tigris. And here they are there, and there it is there. And from the years around 4000 BCE until around 500 BCE, this place, the Fertile Crescent, became a place of remarkable human activity and a variety of civilizations, including the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Akkadians, all developed in slightly different places all around the same time. We're going to spend some time looking primarily at the Sumerians and then a little bit at the Akkadians as well. And depending upon how I feel, we might do a little bit about the Babylonians as well. Let's talk about that word Mesopotamia. As I mentioned to you, it's a Greek word. And if you are kind of scientifically inclined, like when I was in high school, I took an anatomy class, we learned about the root meso, which quite literally means middle. And potamia means river. So like a hippopotamus, a potamus, that's a water horse, right? Hippo is a water horse. Potamia is Greek for river. So the Euphrates to the west and the Tigris to the left, or to the east, and these places here, this Fertile Crescent, now corresponds to modern day Iraq, Iran, and some parts of Saudi Arabia. So we're going to talk about some places that have been on the news a little bit, honestly, but we're going to talk about the historical roots for all of them. And as a way to think about them, I call your attention to the development of writing. So when we spoke about the Paleolithic time frame and the prehistoric culture much more broadly, I mentioned to you that those cultures that are prehistoric have not developed writing. But writing in earnest develops during this time frame in the Fertile Crescent in the ancient Near East. And the development of writing goes through a number of distinct stages in a way that I think is kind of interesting. Early on, it's called cuneiform. It's the writing in wet clay with a stylus or a kind of pen. And if you would imagine, like my kids play with Play-Doh. So you roll out your Play-Doh and then you have a toothpick and you incise into it. And when that clay dries, it becomes permanent. And early on, it's used primarily for administrative reasons, accounting, keeping track of inventories. And early on, it's primarily a pictograph in nature, which means we have an object that corresponds to what the object it represents. And over time, that breakdown between the relationship visually between the idea and the representation of it diminishes and goes down. So if you were to imagine looking at this one, for example, for bird, or better yet, ox, because it's an easy word and I can spell it without looking. So early on, an ox is a representation of an ox, a four-legged mammalian bovine with big horns. And as time goes on, because it takes a long time to draw that ox, over time it breaks down into something a little bit more abstract, and we will call that thing a pictograph. Now, it's an abstract representation of the thing that we're looking at, but it still kind of looks like an ox. And as time further goes on, that representation over here becomes a little bit more abstract. So there's not an easy relationship to get between this object here, this symbol, and the thing it represents, that four-legged horned bovine. And this representation continues, right? So the only way to realize that this means four-legged horned bovine is to memorize that this form equals that. You can't sort of intellectually get there. And this further goes on down this path until you get to two letters. O and X don't look anything like a four-legged horned bovine. That's the development of writing, and that's something the Sumerians almost invent in the West. As I mentioned early on, it's an administrative tool, but as time goes on, it's used for other more reflective reasons, like novels. And at some point in your intellectual life, if you ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you should at least know that it's one of the oldest kind of novels or written stories in the history of literature. It's 4,000 years old. And when you read it, it will sound like elements from the Jewish Bible, which I think is really interesting. So other things that the Sumerians do that I think are pretty fascinating is that they develop farming tools and the casting of metals. Now, you don't know me well, but for the sake of today's discussion, you should know that I'm kind of an indoor boy, and I was never meant to be a farmer because I don't like getting dirty. So I've never actually farmed, but I would wager that tilling a field with a wooden plow is better than tilling a field with your right hand, but not as good as tilling it with a bronze, implement. And so early on, the culture of the ancient Near East developed tools primarily made out of wood. And as time progresses, those tools stop being made from wood and instead are cast from mined metals. And this makes farming a whole lot easier. The Sumerians also developed this thing, gosh, what's it called? Oh yeah, the wheel, which allows you to transport things much quicker. And so the creation of casting of metals and using that for tools, to say nothing of weapons, provides these cultures with a leg up on some of their contemporaries. We'll also look at least kind of quickly, ziggurats, which are an ancient Sumerian religious structure that might look at least a little bit kind of like a pyramid. And so we'll look at religious structures. And then we're not going to really talk about this much, but the Sumerians do invent what we call art historically a register. And a register allows artists to tell increasingly more complex narratives in a work of art. So let me just show you a very, very brief example. It's kind of a cool object. This right here is called the Standard of Ur. It's kind of about the size of a shoebox, and it's made out of wood and then laid in with lapis lazuli and gold and a certain kind of red limestone. And this sort of tells a comic book kind of story, right? This is panel 1, panel 2, and panel 3. And this idea of being able to tell a more complex narrative is something the Sumerians invent. It's a little bit different than, say, something like this from the Paleolithic time frame, which has one story, right? Bird-headed man with bird on a stick and a buffalo. That's one story. But the Sumerians begin to do things that are increasingly more complex. So that is the idea of the register. So the Sumerians and the cultures in the ancient Near East develop a lot of really fantastic visual elements that carry on throughout the history of art. I want to show you a couple of ziggurats, one that is in kind of rough shape, all things considered, and one that has been more recently restored. What you're looking at here is an object in the background here with local neighborhood scale figures there. That's called the White Temple. And it is a ziggurat. A ziggurat is a Greek word that translates roughly into little mountain. It dates from around 3200 BCE, so to frame it in a different kind of way, it's 5,000 years old. When, as far as archaeologists can tell, its original size was about 61 feet square and about 16 feet tall. And what you're looking at here is the wooden part of it, or pardon me, the stone and mud brick part of it. And originally on the top would have been a wooden temple. Now, let me say a couple things about this, and they're the kinds of things that might seem really obvious, but you probably haven't thought of them before. One of those things is that we can only make stuff out of stuff we have around. So if you want to make a stone building, you need to have access to stone. There's no Lowe's or Home Depot around. So if you want to build something out of stone, you have to quarry that stone. You have to cut that stone. You have to transport that stone. If you want to make something out of wood, you have to have access to big trees, not bushes. You can't make a wooden temple out of a bush. You need trees. And so when you look at this structure, you can notice that it has been made out of mud brick, a building material that is ancient, solid, and durable when used in the right kind of way. And you might look at this and say, Brian, that looks like it's in pretty bad shape. You're not going to look this good 5,000 years from now either. So all things considered, it's in a remarkable state of preservation, but it has deteriorated over time. Mud brick is not impervious to rain, and over time it does break down. On the top of it originally was an extravagantly decorated wooden temple. Now, I give you the picture here on the left-hand side. I'll show you some other pictures in a second of a slightly different part of ancient Sumeria, and I ask you, where are the trees? And the idea that there aren't any. So the wood for this temple comes from a great, great distance. And again, the greater distance something comes, the more valuable and precious it is. Now, the Sumerian culture during this time frame was one that was led by a leader, and a leader that had a special relationship with the panoply of gods that you and I, as regular people, might not have had. And a ziggurat was intended to allow the leader to ascend it, enter the temple, and then commune with the gods. And the gods would speak to the ruler and provide him with leadership and guidance so that they could do certain things as a culture. The gods would tell you when to plant, when to harvest, when to go to war, when to have a turkey sandwich, and when to take a nap. And you did not have access to that. I did, because I'm the ruler, which gives me a certain kind of access to knowledge that most people don't have. The going up, the temple itself was very much a part of the process, and I'll show you the ziggurat at in a second. Going up the stairs and circumambulating around it was very much a part of the ritual, and then going into the temple allowed me to talk to the gods. Now, please note I'm using the word gods, plural. The Sumerians, like many other ancient cultures, have not one, but many gods. And we call this polytheism. Poly, Latin for many, theism, Greek for gods. Polytheism. And I'll just show you a picture of Anana here. Anana was a female deity who was the goddess of both love and war. She shows up in all kinds of different settings. I mean, here's a head statue of here. Here she is sort of standing wearing a fancy crown. You'll see in a second. Here, nope, there is Anana again. So the Sumerians have many gods. They are polytheistic, which is different than most cultures today. And so going up allows me to speak with the gods. The gods provide me with guidance as to what you, my sniveling lowly friends, to do. Harvest, plant, flood, war. Now, the White Temple and Ziggurat here in Uruk might not be in great shape, but the Ziggurat at which is part of the Sumerian culture and built around 4,000 years ago, is in significantly better shape. And part of the reason that's in better shape is that it was restored, I think, in 1978, but that might not be the exact year. I'll show you a slightly different picture here, and you can see what this looks like. There is a front central ramp here, another side ramp here. There's 100 steps in all of them. Again, 100 is kind of a universally acknowledged significant digit. And the ruler walking up this ramp or the side ramps and then walking around the temple, we call that circumambulation. Circumambulation, the walking around, was very much a part of the process. Circumambulation happens in a lot of cultures, both ancient and modern. A few weeks ago, I was in Florence and I was taking some students around a cloister at a church called Santa Maria Novella. And we talked about the idea of walking around this square oyster as part of a religious process. So the leader would walk up this and then walk around this temple. As you can see, the temple is largely the platform upon which it sat is now rubble, and the wooden temple itself has long since been destroyed. Generally speaking, wooden buildings do not last 4,000 years because wood rots and catches on fire. Both this temple here and this one here were both arranged around the cardinal points. And what I mean to suggest to you is if you were to look at this corner, sort of facing that way, faces south, this one north, that one east, and this one west. This means that these cultures 5,000 years ago had developed an understanding of the cardinal directions and points, and certainly an attempt to understand in a way in which you yourself do not now, the mechanism of the movement of stars, the stars in the nighttime sky. I bet few of you right now can point up and point to the North Star. This is very much a part of these ancient cultures' day-to-day process. Here's your obligatory picture of an American troop of Humvees in front of the Ziggurat in Ur, mostly because this was taken over by the American Army following the invasion in 2002. And I even found this photograph of an American C-130 flying over top of it. This was a religious structure, but it is not a burial structure. And we'll talk a little bit about burial structures and religious structures and the ways in which these might be similar and different in time. But for the time being, please know that this was a religious structure that has gone through some changes. It looks similar to other kinds of religious structures that are burial structures, but this was not one of them. This is not a place to remember the dead. This is a place for a person or a very small group of people to commune with some deities. I can't explain the next picture that I'll show you, but I saw it a couple of years ago when doing a Google search for the Ziggurat at Ur, and I think they're Rice Krispie treats covered with peanut butter. I've always thought it was funny, particularly this young lad right here who looks like he's very, very excited. So the Ziggurat at Ur is something that we're going to come back to when we look at some Egyptian burial structures in just a little while. I'd like to switch gears just a little bit and talk about a different culture, a different group of people in the ancient Near East culture, and that is the Akkadians. And what you're looking at here is the victory stele of Naram Sin. This is actually very easy to date because we know when Naram Sin was the ruler. And this was meant to commemorate a victory he had over a group of people called the Lulubi. This object is made out of sandstone, which is, all things considered, a relatively soft and easier to carve than many stones. And as you can see, it is a kind of shallow relief. And I'll show you a detail in a second. But if you look at this, you can sort of see a shadow here along the underside of his arm. That's because there's a raking light illuminating it this way. This object is covered with writing, and I'll show you some details of that in a second. And again, reinforcing that this is part of a historic culture. There are two different inscriptions made at two different times. One chronicles the victory that Naram Sin had over the Lalubi, and another inscription, almost a kind of graffiti, can also be found and read on it when this stele was removed from Acadia and taken back to Susa as a spoil of war. Means it's not surprising then when I go off to war and want to kill people who don't look or think like me, when I'm done with them, I take back their cool stuff to my own house. And that very much happened with this. In a way that is maybe not that surprising, but we haven't looked at that many objects. This is one of the first works of art to contain landscape elements in it. You will see that we have a kind of mountain. We have some nighttime stars that are shining, and you will see some trees and like pathways in which people are walking up. So this is an attempt of having different ground lines, people like on a lower level and a middle ground and a higher ground, but also elements of land that designate a place like trees and mountains. And another thing that we'll talk about is something called hieratic scaling. That's kind of an important thing, and so much so that I'll say it again. Hieratic scaling. Hieratic scaling is a very simple and old tool of indicating who's important in a scene merely by their size. So in this context, Naram Sin is the most important person, and he's shown bigger than everyone. He's shown bigger than those who he leads, and he's certainly bigger than those who are pleading for his mercy. And we'll have a chance to show you a detail of that now. Now, if we were in class, I would pick out the person who I thought was the most nimble and limber in the class. I would invite them to come to the front of the classroom, and I would ask them to stand this way. This is a peculiar way to depict a human body, but it is a way that is ancient, old, and really, really consistent. Let's look at his body. To begin with, his lower body here is shown in profile, right? We don't see the front of his foot, we see the side of his foot. So his lower body is sort of turned 90 degrees from us, as if, imagine your teacher standing in the front of the classroom. They're not facing you, they're standing to the side as if they're walking from left to right. Their upper body here has then been pivoted 90 degrees. So it's as if your teacher is standing in the front of the room as if they're going to walk out the front door, but they've pivoted at the waist so that you see their upper body frontally. Their head then has been turned back as if they're looking out the front door, because now you see one eye and their nose rather than two eyes and their nose frontally. And then the horned hat they're wearing, which signifies him as being a kind of deity, has been put on sideways. So imagine me having a baseball cap on, and rather than having the bill of the cap on my forehead, having it come off the side of my head. We call this twisted perspective. His body has been shown essentially from four different points of view: lower body in profile, upper body frontally, head in profile, hat frontally. If I had a ballerina in class, they might be able to stand this way without falling down, but the football players have no chance. What they've done is shown us the most recognizable and easy to depict view of each body part. Imagine your hand, and if you hold up your hand as if you're going to give someone a high five, that's an easy hand to draw. Like, I'm not an art maker. I've never taken a drawing class. I could kind of draw that hand. And now instead, take your hand and point it at someone, point your finger at someone, and have them draw that. That's really hard. So this is an easy way to draw someone's lower body, right? I can do that. and this is an easy way to draw their upper body. So they've taken these two easy ways of drawing the human body and combined it in a way that no one but a ballerina could ever do. I mentioned to you hieratic scaling and writing. So here you can see how big Naram is compared to the little guys over here. I ask you one of my favorite questions, how is Bob's day? And Bob's day is not so good because Bob has an arrow going through his neck. That's not good for Bob. To say nothing of the fact that over next to him is Steve, and let me go back. Whoops. Steve is quite literally begging for mercy. He's got his hands up in a universal gesture for, please don't kill me, Brian. In the upper part of this register, you can see that we have these big shiny orby things. There's one there, another there, and although the stone has been damaged, you can see this little triangle, and that bit there suggests that there is a third one up there. These are likely representations of a unique celestial event that very well could be something like a comet. You and I know what comets are. We'll talk a little bit about this in this class. Like a comet is a big hunk of intergalactic gook that comes around, enters the orbit of the Earth somehow. Things fly off of it and create a tail. Like we know what that is. But 5,000 years ago, I'll be honest, 300 years ago, people thought it was a message from God. Like God is angry or God is happy. God wants me to go kill the Lulubi, whatever. And so this likely symbolizes a sense of God's favor, which I think is really important. I mentioned to you also that we have landscape elements. This, my friends, is a tree. Now, I don't mean to suggest to you that it's a great tree, but it absolutely is a tree. And so what we have are artists 4,500 years ago attempting to create a landscape to provide a setting for this. We have Naram Sin climbing up the mountain, killing people who don't look or think like him. And this object is 6'7", which makes it likely taller than everyone in your classroom. I mean, it's about the size of Shaquille O'Neal. Now, LeBron James, I think he's 6'9". So this is a huge and colossal object. And it's covered with writing, right? Writing allows us to do a lot of different things, but one is not forget, right? So if you're sitting in a classroom somewhere listening to me yodel about Akkadian art and you're not writing something down, you might forget it, right? If you write it down, you have a record of it. And the writing down of that record is really, really important. And also, having things written down means you don't have an excuse for not knowing them. And that is very much what the Code of Hammurabi is entirely about. This was made in 1780 BCE, and it has two sides of it. One side has an image of Hammurabi talking to a god, and on the front of it is writing, and on the back side of it is all writing. Here you can see what it looks like when you go visit it in the Louvre. And the Code of Hammurabi was, in most historians believe, the first attempt in the West to codify and write down the rules. Like, this is a big deal. And some of the ideas about this still exist to this day. For example, the next time you get a speeding ticket and the police officer comes up to you and says, hello, little Jimmy, do you know why I pulled you over? And you can say, no, I didn't know why you pulled me over. And he can say, well, I pulled you over because you were speeding. And you can say, speeding? What's that? And you say, well, little Jimmy, speeding is going faster than the speed limit. And you can say, well, I don't know what a speed limit is. And the cop says, I don't care. It's written down somewhere. Like a famous jurisprudence line. Ignorance is no excuse before the law. Just because you don't know that it's wrong doesn't mean you can't do it. And the same is very much true here. This object, which is covered with writing, makes it clear that you have every expectation of knowing exactly what the law is. And over here, you can see Hammurabi and the Babylonian giver of laws, Shamash. And I ask you to think about these characters here. How has Hammurabi been shown? I know he's dressed in a way in which Naram Sin is not, but here he is standing. Again, let me go back here. The same kind of drill, right? Head in profile, upper body frontal, and you get the idea lower body in profile, and he's standing in front of the god. And I ask you, who's taller? And you might say, Hammurabi. I said, good. And what happens if Shamash stands up? That guy is enormous because even though Hammurabi's an important dude, he's not a god. I mean, think about the god's hat here. This is the best hat you're going to see today. I mean, this is the best hat we've looked at since we looked at the Arnolfini heads when he had that great like hat. He's hat got 1, 2, 3, 4 horns. Look at poor Naram. Naram Sin's only got 1 horn. This guy's got 4 horns. But also think about Hammurabi himself. Think about what he's doing. He's standing there. Does he look bashful? Does he look shy? Does he look scared standing before God? No, he's not. He's confident. He's assured of himself. I mean, I gotta tell you, if I was standing before my God and Maker, I think I'd be a little bit scared. Not Hammurabi, because he is confident in who and what he is. And I think that's a really fascinating idea. Now, one of the things I wanted to show you was something from ancient Sumeria. Again, this object here on your right, 1780 BCE. This over here, about 700 years earlier. And it's a cylinder seal. It's like a kind of like a small little piece of stone that's been incised in it, and you could roll it across some wet clay and it would create this impression. And here we have Anana and one of her priestesses. And so I call your attention to the sun here, which kind of looks like what we just looked at here, and that's kind of cool. But look at the ways in which this attendant, this priestess, is standing in a way, oh heavens, standing in a way that is similar to that of Hammurabi. This does not mean that whoever made this saw this, right? This is a little thing that was buried. They found it, 200 years ago. But what it does mean, and this is so important that I'm going to say that this is so important, is that this is one of the socially acceptable ways to depict a priest or leader. This is how they were shown. It doesn't mean Bob, who made this, saw this work of art, but it means Bob, who made this, was aware of the tradition of depicting priests or rulers in front of a god. And that's a really, really important idea. Now, the stele of Hammurabi is filled with laws, and some of those laws are really, really interesting. And some of them, forgive me for using such very specific legal terms, but they lay the smackdown on people. I mean, here are just a couple of them. If anyone commits a robbery and is caught, they shall be put to death. And what are you going to do? Argue? No, that's an unfair rule. You can't argue about whether or not a rule's unfair. You can argue about whether or not you did it. If a son strike his father, cut off his hands. This was the rule. Don't do it. I mean, I sort of think about, as someone at Louisiana Tech who serves on the Honor Council, if the punishment for cheating on an exam was death, nobody would cheat. It would never happen. What are you going to do? Risk your life over a math test? No, thank you. And so this laid down all of the rules for everyone to know. And so there was no cause for confusion. This, like the palette of Norma, is a really deep relief that at first you don't notice until you visit in person. Um, and one of the great things about my job is students will take it and eventually end up somewhere fabulous, and they take pictures and send them to me. So way back in the fall of 2005, when I was just a young whippersnapper, I taught a class at GW, and Kathleen Scaranza, who's now, gosh, she's married now. I don't even know what her married name is. We're on Facebook together, but she's an attorney in Washington, D.C., and so she went to the Louvre and took a picture of it, and sent it off to me. So you get an idea as to the scale of this. This is 7'6". This is a monument for all to see. With the ancient Near East, we have art that's about a couple of things. One is rulership and leadership, and the other one very much is about the creation and distribution of laws, and the stela of Hammurabi makes that absolutely clear. So this module, or this artifact, was very much about the art of the ancient Near East. We looked at a kind of religious structure. With the Ziggurat, we looked at the stela of Naram Sin and the Code of Hammurabi. Some of these ideas from the ancient Near East culture will echo forward in time with us when we look at Egyptian art next.